Chile in 1970. A massive crowd of over 800,000 Chileans, 10% of the population, gather outside the presidential palace. They are the jubilant supporters of Latin America's first democratically elected Marxist president, Salvador Allende. By the end of his short 3 years in office, Allende would initiate a land reform allowing for increased productivity, a redistribution of goods that gave the working and peasant classes a decent standard of living, and nationalized key industries once owned by foreigners. However, the country's ambitious experiment with socialism would be cut short by the CIA-funded military coup d'etat led by General Augusto Pinochet on September 11, 1973. The far-right dictator would commit numerous crimes, including the illegal torture and killing of thousands of civilians, a censorship of the media, and imprisonment of hundreds of political adversaries. The harsh repression by the fascist government would be amplified by the failed laissez-faire economic policies inspired by Milton Friedman, which saw a rise in inflation and worsening economic conditions for the working class. Prior to Allende, between 1950 and 1970, the Chilean economy expanded at meager rates. GDP grew at an average rate of 3.8% per annum, whereas real GDP per capita increased at an average yearly rate of 1.6%. The economy depended for decades on the sale of copper abroad, but since foreigners both set the price of copper and owned the mines, Chile was cheated out of most of her profits. The country also had great difficulty in feeding itself, as approximately one-third of Chile's imports consisted of foodstuffs, at least in the period since World War II. As early as the 1960s, sociologists classified 60% of the families as impoverished. Over this period, Chile's economic performance was the poorest among Latin America's large and medium-sized countries. In 1970 especially, the last year of the government of Eduardo Frei Montalva, the inflation rate stood at 35%. Those, among other factors, planted the seeds for the radical socialist change to come. Upon arrival, Allende sought to nationalize the illustrious copper industry, which provided 3/4 of the value of national exports. A welcome change of pace, as Chileans, regardless of their political affiliation, welcomed Allende's policy of taking over the foreign-owned copper industry. Upon nationalization, the Chile Economic News reported a rise in copper output from 571.3 thousands of metric tons in 1970 to 593 in 1972. An increase despite the strikes of managerial and white-collar personnel at the mines. Allende also proceeded to nationalize the banking and credit sectors, as well as other key industries, but these efforts were not as well received as the copper industry, especially among the middle and upper classes. Though inflation continued to climb, Allende's reforms managed to increase the purchasing power of the working class. Meat and milk made daily appearances in their homes, alongside the newly acquired appliances such as radios and toys that were previously unattainable. Moreover, President Allende promulgated and enforced an ambitious land reform to address Chile's ongoing food import problem caused by the overspeculation of land instead of agricultural production. In his first year of office, Allende distributed more land, 5.5 million acres, than his Christian Democratic predecessor had in 6 years. The landless rural proletariat appreciated Allende's actions, which were in strong contrast to the grandiose promises of former governments. However, not all were pleased with the change, as President Richard Nixon pressured the World Bank, the Export-Import Bank, and other international financial institutions to refuse loans needed by the Chileans for their ambitious projects and stopped foreign aid to Chile altogether once Allende took office.
Chile, of course, is interested in obtaining loans from international organizations where we have a vote. And I indicated that wherever we had a vote, where Chile was involved, that unless there were strong considerations on the other side, that we would vote against them.
Moreover, President Nixon authorized $10 million for the covert operation against Allende, instructing it to be carried out without the knowledge of the U.S. Embassy in Chile, and ordered CIA Director Richard Helms to make the economy scream. Thus, the U.S., the supposed defender of democracy and political freedom in the world, would assist in dealing the fatal blow to Chilean political freedom, leaving a lasting ripple effect in Chilean politics for years to come. On September 11, 1973, the capital of Santiago was awakened by the roar of tank engines and the march of soldiers on her streets, as La Moneda, Allende's presidential palace, was surrounded by Pinochet's men. Told to surrender by 11 a.m., Allende refused to back down, defending democracy to his last breath. Soon enough, a little before noon, 2 fighter jets flew over La Moneda, blasting open the walls and barricades, leaving a trail of destruction behind them. Soldiers poured in, and Allende was found dead by suicide shortly after, killed by his own hand, leaving behind an inspiring message to the Chilean people.
momento gris y amargo donde la traición pretende imponer. Sigan ustedes sabiendo que mucho más temprano que tarde, de nuevo, abrirán las grandes alamedas por donde pase el hombre libre para construir una sociedad mejor. ¡Viva Chile! ¡Viva el pueblo! ¡Vivan los trabajadores!
Pinochet became the most brutal dictator of Chilean history, arresting those sympathetic of the Allende rule and killing those that opposed him. Most notably, in a population of 11 million Chileans, 3,200 were murdered by the state, more than 1,000 disappeared, some of them thrown into the ocean, others into pits of lime. Tens of thousands were tortured, and more than 200,000 went into political exile. The most infamous of examples being the massive imprisonment of 20,000 Chileans in the Estadio Nacional situated in Santiago, where, for 8 brutal weeks, local Chileans were rounded up, beaten, and tortured at the site of what was once a national symbol of pride. The coup, orchestrated by the CIA, not only brought forth executive change, but economic change as well, as the now dubbed Chicago Boys, Chilean men who studied under the guidance of economist Milton Friedman, provided financial advice as the military was reluctant to move against Allende unless they had an alternative economic plan. And so, the Chicago Boys, especially under Sergio de Castro, gave them an economic plan. The plan was a 500-page economic blueprint dubbed El Ladrido, or the Brick, aimed to stabilize the economy by allowing the private sector to freely operate, prioritizing the private sector as a predominant factor in the economy, and by allowing prices to fluctuate freely in accordance with the laws of competition. Additionally, the approach to the overbearing inflation of the time was a drastic reduction of government spending, believing that inflation, the worst enemy of economic progress, is a direct result of monetary expansion. One must keep in mind, however, that the exchange program that brought the Chileans to Chicago was funded by public money from the US government's .44 foreign aid program. The program was targeted at weakening Keynesian developmentalism in Latin America. The changes came as planned, since at bayonet point, unions were outlawed, labor laws were abolished, universities were stifled, national healthcare and social security programs were privatized, and these already unequal societies were further stratified into rich and poor, strong and weak, favored and unfavored. Alas, even the most brutal of military regimes must come to an end. On October 5, 1988, a national referendum was held to determine whether the military junta and its leader Pinochet would remain in power for another 8 years. The vote yielded unsurprising results, as a no vote won with nearly 56%, ending the 16-year-old junta that day and restoring once more the democratic process. Following the events, presidential and parliamentary elections took place as scheduled on December 14, 1989, with Christian Democrat Patricio Aylwin taking office the following March. Repercussions to Pinochet followed, as on May 28, 2004, the Santiago Appeals Court ruled that Pinochet be stripped of his immunity to face trial for kidnapping, illegal association, and torture. Alas, thanks to Pinochet's deteriorating health, Pinochet died on December 10, 2006, of a heart attack without standing a formal trial for his war crimes, leaving little to no closure for the thousands of Chilean families his regime affected.